So good afternoon. I'm Lori Freund with the Bridges Library System and coordinator for SUI offerings. We are we are glad to, and welcome you to our webinar, It's a Trap, How to Avoid Giving Legal Advice in Reference Services. This webinar is sponsored by the Wisconsin Law Library in the Southeastern Wisconsin, or SUI, library systems, which includes Arrowhead, Bridges, Kenosha County, Lake Shores, Milwaukee County, and Monarch Library Systems. Our presenter today is Carol Hassler, who is a librarian and web developer at the Wisconsin State Law Library, where she designs and maintains the library's website, blog, and social media profiles, and provides reference assistance and legal research training to library staffs and users. We're so glad to have Carol with us today, and we're going to let her begin our training.
Thank you for having me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to all of you. Please ask a question at any time. I'm going to be watching the Q&A feature and the chat, and I'm happy to answer questions as they come up. I know sometimes that makes it a little bit easier to address any confusion or lingering questions you have. So our goals for today are to talk about the tools and sources that are available for doing legal research in Wisconsin and finding answers for your users. We'll also talk about the reference interview and how that can work with legal questions. We'll talk about patron interactions and tips for communicating with users. And we'll also have some sample reference questions. Now, there are two handouts linked in the chat. One is just a quick summary of things to say or not say with users, and it also has some linked resources for learning more on the back about legal research. The presentation is also included in a Google Drive link from the chat window. Okay. So a little bit of background to start off with. The Wisconsin State Law Library is the oldest library in the state, and our mission as a library is to serve the Supreme Court and the state of Wisconsin to facilitate equal access to the law. And what does that mean? We like to really emphasize, especially with public librarians, that we are a resource for you and for your users. So one thing that I'll probably reiterate a few times during this session is that you can contact the State Law Library Reference Desk for questions for your patron or for yourself. Okay, I see a question came in from Q&A about tax questions or issues. And that's a great question. We're not really going to touch on that in this class too much, but I think some of our discussion about legal forms and reference interactions might apply a little bit to your tax question. So we'll address that a little bit later on today. So today, the State Law Library gets questions from a wide variety of people. We serve the public, we serve attorneys, we serve the judicial system in Wisconsin. We have branches in Dane and Milwaukee County in the courthouses that also provide services. Now, in the time of COVID, of course, our services, like a lot of libraries, have changed a little bit. Right now, we don't have walk-in service, but we're providing curbside, essentially curbside service. And we do a lot of help through email, phone, and sending things out in the mail. So that's always an option for reaching people, even if we are not able to have people come into the library and research. We have card holders at our library. Those include judges and court staff, attorneys and legal professionals, and government employees. And the government employee is relevant to you all because that includes public librarians. So public librarians are able to sign up for Wisconsin State Law Library card. And this is so you can personally access our online databases like Hein Online and Index to Legal Periodicals, and that can sometimes help with some of your research there. Okay, so a little chat a communication opportunity here. What types of legal research questions do your users ask? I'm assuming that some of you have been asked legal research questions in the past. They may have to do with court forms. They might have to do with where is a law on X subject. But most people are going to come across some kind of legal reference question. So some of the common questions that we get include how to find court forms. Is there a law on a certain topic? Or how do I figure out how to do a legal procedure? So how do I get divorced? How do I start a small claims case? And a whole host of related questions for those different types of topics. When I'm faced with an unfamiliar topic, I have a couple of strategies. So uh, Google or other search engines do have a bad reputation in some circles. I find it can be very helpful for a very fast and dirty overview of a topic, or to find some general grounding terms that I can use to search in a more reputable database, for example. So a couple of things that I will try will be to check a likely book that we have in our collection, do a web search, or do a search in a specialized database, like a case law database. So for example, here at the State Law Library, we have access to lexis.com and Westlaw, and that gives us a whole host of other things that we can search on as well. Gut instinct and quick information gathering can require quick source evaluation. So if you're on the phone or you've got somebody right in front of you asking a legal research question, sometimes you can feel a lot of pressure to try and turn around and find an answer for them. And we're going to talk about how to evaluate legal sources so that we can turn around those faster answers, or learn when we need to take a little bit more time and be a little bit more deliberate in finding information. So sometimes it's hard to figure out where to find what you're looking for, or even how far back you can get it. So where can you find circuit court case opinions? How does that compare to appellate court case law? And what does appellate court even mean? A lot of these terms that you're going to come across when you're doing legal research can be unfamiliar to you. They can be unfamiliar to your users as well. Sometimes a good glossary is a great resource. The Wisconsin court system has a interpreters page on their website that links to a lot of glossaries in a variety of languages, including English. And that's a really good source for some quick legal term definitions. So one source that I like to go to when I need to do some research and I'm trying to figure out what is the primary source is Wisconsin Legal Research. This is a book that was published a little while ago, and it gives an overview of primary and secondary sources in Wisconsin. It gives date ranges and sources. Can you find it online? Is it available in print? And it gives a quick overview of the research process, the legal research process. So this is a single volume, fairly slim book, and it's a pretty good primer to legal research. And it's something you can pick up and thumb through if you are trying to help somebody right away as well. It's not unusual for us to get questions from people based on a nebulous answer they found on an online legal forum or an online site that has articles written by a variety of people. Could be attorneys from other states, could be just a journalist. One type of question that often tends to give us a lot of confusion are questions arising from lists of weird laws. Is it true that in Wisconsin, people can do this or you can't do that? And tracking down the source of those very vaguely cited things can sometimes be difficult. So here's an example of one that I handled recently. I'd gotten a question from somebody who said, I found this article online and it says that other states, including Arizona, California, Nevada, Ohio, Wisconsin, etc., have cited in favor of homeowners when it comes to the public display of political signs. And it doesn't cite anything. It doesn't give me a case. It doesn't give me a statute or an administrative code section, a local ordinance, nothing. So I'm left to try and figure out, well, where does this originate? What is backing up this claim in this article? And it was a little bit tricky, and a great example, I think, of not always being able to find a clear, definite answer, because I was able to find a statute about political signs and condominium associations, but I couldn't find a similar statute for homeowners associations in Wisconsin. And whether or not that is going to be considered related or considered applying is not something that I can make a call on for this patron. I can't decide, yes, this condo association law is going to apply to you, or this is what they base this statement on. What I can do is I can provide what I found, and then the patron has to draw their own conclusion about what it is that's available. So one thing that we have to do as librarians is evaluate the source, not only that we're being presented with by the user, but the sources that we're using to try and confirm or give more information for our patrons. I like to use the American Association of Law Librarians Access to Legal Information Guide, and that is linked on the second page of this handout. And what that does is it essentially guides you through how to evaluate a source. And this is really similar to how you evaluate any kind of reference source in a reference transaction. So one big concept in legal research is understanding the difference between primary and secondary sources. So secondary sources are books or articles that interpret the law or they interpret court opinions and try and come to a conclusion. A primary source or primary law is created by government entities. So for example, the legislative branch creates the statutes or code, administrative agencies create regulations, and the judiciary creates court opinions. But there's more to that too. Agencies or boards can publish decisions. Courts may have local rules that you have to look at. And professional associations can sometimes create codes of conduct or entire codes of law, which are adopted and enforced by reference. For example, fire protection codes are often adopted by reference. They're commercially created, but they're adopted by reference into local ordinances. So there can be a lot of complex sources when you are trying to find the source of a law. Especially for federal law, there are often a lot of sources for the same information. So if you do a web search for a US code citation, you're going to get a lot of different results. And there are some that are published by the government. So you can look for that .gov address in the URL. And there are some that are essentially republished by other organizations or educational institutions. So always pay attention to the source when you find a law reprinted online. So what do you use? What can people consider official? In Wisconsin, Print sources used to be considered the only official version. Right now, the Wisconsin statutes online are certified. Other words that you can look for when you're looking at online laws, maybe from other states, are words like these laws are authenticated. And what that means is that these laws are certified to be correct and official. Um, what people used to have to do was get certified copies from books. And while that's a service we still offer at the State Law Library, we do try and direct people to this online as well. Our website's a starting place for a lot of our research. Oh, I see there isn't a link visible to handouts. Let me see if I can just paste those in again, just a moment.
I just repasted those
Oh,
into the
thank you. I
chat, so
appreciate that. Great. Okay. So our website's a starting place for a lot of our research. wilawlibrary.gov has something called legal topics pages. And our legal topics pages were created years ago basically as a big bookmarking system for our librarians to use to keep track of all the good sources that we really wanted to use to answer reference questions that we get a lot. Those have direct links to Wisconsin and federal law on our Wisconsin legal topic pages. And we also have some tutorials that you can refer people to for learning additional research tips. Okay, so talking about jurisdiction, this is actually a really important concept when you are doing legal research. Different states might have similar laws to Wisconsin, but they use different terminology or have small but important differences. And you'll most often probably come up with people giving you laws or law references to other states when they are asking, is there a similar law in Wisconsin? Or sometimes people will have an online article or reference an online article, and they may not realize that it's talking about California law, for example, or another state's procedures. So when you are doing a search, sometimes you will find that the laws that people are finding or trying to figure out for Wisconsin, they are getting their initial information based on another state's laws. There are a lot of laws that affect everyday life, and many of those are on the local level. So we often will help people research local ordinances for their county or municipality. On our website, and I'll pull that up really quickly, under our legal topics pages, we have a link to ordinances and codes, and we try and list every single municipality and county that has online codes on our website. So this is our first place to look if we have a question that may involve local law. So some examples of what can involve local law would include things like um, uh, what signs are allowed on the street or on businesses. They may include zoning questions or noise ordinances, things like that. Sometimes a topic area can straddle a couple different jurisdictions with overlapping laws. For example, there are employment discrimination laws on both the Wisconsin and federal level. There are federal and state laws for firearms. There are state and local laws for fences, so like a residential fence that you'd have in your property. And tribal law can intersect with state or federal law. So when you're searching sources, it's important to know that sometimes the answer might be found from a different jurisdictional level. Our legal topic pages are basically a cross between a Pathfinder and browser bookmarks. So we give quick access to current law sources. I did want to point out our Wisconsin law page. This is just a snapshot of it. And this is basically a quick jumping point to the online statutes, as well as the archive and related information. So if you need to research old laws, it's actually really easy in Wisconsin. There's a great archive online you can use. You just have to find it first. So one place that I really like going when I'm trying to find laws that might be related to maybe another state or an article about another state is to look at a 50-state survey. And 50-state surveys basically take a topic, sometimes they're broad, sometimes they're narrow, and they break that topic down into the state's laws. So here's an example. This is from Hein Online, which again you can access with a Wisconsin State Law Library card. And this is from a resource called National Survey of State Laws. You can see they've got a big list of topics. And if I choose one of these like bullying, what it's going to do is just give me a table. So most of these 50-state surveys are going to be a table or something kind of easy to scan. And they give you typically an actual citation to the law or regulation. And sometimes we'll give you a summary as well. So we can scroll all the way down to Wisconsin, for example, to see all the Wisconsin statutes that this publication has identified as having to do with bullying. You can find a lot of 50-state surveys online if you're searching. You can put in a topic and 50-state, and that can sometimes pull those up. I also like searching for 50-state surveys from an organization called the National Conference of State Legislatures, which posts a lot of those kind of multi-state surveys on their website. So a few things you can do when you find a source is to check for context. So check the website. Is it operating from a particular perspective? Does it have a bias to it that you can, that might skew the answer that somebody's going to get from it? Here's an example of a page on service animals and housing from the Tenant Resource Center. And the Tenant Resource Center is a Dane County-based organization that provides tenant advocacy services. So they do have a perspective they're operating from. They try to educate landlords, but they're also there to advocate for tenants. One thing that I like about their site, and we actually do link to their site on our website, is that they heavily cite their discussions of topics. And you can see it sometimes makes it a little bit difficult to read. They've got a lot of citations. They use color coding to indicate different changes in the law. And it can be kind of a lot to take in. But because they heavily cite things, I can go in and I can say, okay, you say that this is the law, or this is true in Wisconsin. I'm going to take this citation and be able to give that direct citation to a user as well. So it's always nice to find those sources, even if you do think, well, maybe a bias does exist. If there are citations that you can pull from to hand over to your users, that can be really helpful to guide people into primary law sources a little bit more. So when you're looking at a site, you want to evaluate if it's citing a section of the law and does it quote it out of context? And that's a really hard thing to make a judgment call on your own. So always remember that you've got those caveats. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but we often will say we can't provide a definitive answer, or we'll quote things directly in our responses to people. I often strongly encourage people to read through the sources that we send them, because we can't summarize these things for them. We can't give a 2-line summary of some of the laws that they may need to read through. Check for disclaimers on the website or position statements. Determine the ruling source, look for those citations, and then the user should always read the source material, whether it's a court opinion, a statute, an administrative code section. That is going to do two things. One is it's going to give people a little bit more context of what they're looking for, and it's going to address currency. So sometimes when people go and find information online or in print books, it can affect both because the law changes all the time. Currency can be a real issue, and you can look up a statute online and see the most recent version. The online statutes are updated constantly. The administrative code is updated constantly. So you can go on there to get those quick updates that you need. When you're looking at a site, you want to check for the last update or revision on that. You want to find out how it's been updated. And you want to verify information in some way, or at least pass that on to your user. So this is an example of an article that was on LegalZoom for a while. And it's a great example of the ever-changing nature of the law. So on the surface, it's a really nice article. It's very readable. It gives a summary of the law. It reads a little bit procedural as well in terms of this moving notice that's required. But in 2018, when this article was still published, and this was in fact online until, I want to say, late 2019, the law changed in 2018 and made some changes to the notice requirements. And that wasn't discussed at all in this article because this article just wasn't updated. But it also didn't have any citations to the statute. So there is a statute on moving notice, and there was before the change in the law. And if this article had included the statute number, you could have gone online to say, oh, well, this isn't the same as what was in the article. But when it's not printed in there, it can be a little bit trickier to find a source. The other complicated thing about changes in the law to be aware of is the concept of effective dates. So here I've got a lot of text. At the top, I've got a screenshot of the end of a published act of 2017 Wisconsin Act 203. And at the end of the act, it has a section called Initial Applicability. And this talks about when that moving statute or that moving notice takes effect and what kind of cases it applies to. So effective dates can sometimes be included at the end of an act. Sometimes they can be included in the statute itself. And sometimes there's nothing written specifically into the statute or act, but instead it's based on the date of publication. So there can be some questions, I think, about when something is effective. And in fact, you may get a question, does this apply to my case? And that's a question you can't answer. You can't give a yes or no. All you can do is provide links to the primary law and any interpretive sources you can find. So when you find a citation to an older law or a vague reference to an older law, how do you find what it is now? So sometimes laws will be kind of the same from session to session, but they'll be renumbered. So sometimes a statute chapter might be renumbered, or a specific statute might be moved to a different chapter entirely of the Wisconsin statutes. And when you look up the older citation you found, you end up at kind of a dead end. So there are a couple of ways to get in and find either a statute based on the topic, for example, a general article like this that doesn't have citations, or based on an old citation that you found. And for that, I like to go to the Wisconsin Statutes Index or the Administrative Code Subject Index. And to get there, you'll go to the Statutes table of contents on the legislature's website. We link to this on our Wisconsin law page as well as our home page. Because I answer a lot of questions, I have this bookmarked, but you can also get into it from the legislature's website. And it's going to be slow for me, so I'm going to cut that out and go here instead. Okay, so if you're on the statutes page, you go to statutes related, and if you're at the administrative code table of contents, it's the same place. You go to the code related. There's a link for statutes index here. And the statutes index is a very big subject index to Wisconsin statutes. So you can type in, you can try and scroll, it takes a very, very long time. You can use this table of subject heads for a quick view, but I usually just use the search to get into the subject index. And here that gets you into the main heading terms, landlord and tenant. And you can browse through the index to either find the general statute chapters that apply or specific sections as well. So I really like using the subject index to try and pinpoint those mystery questions. So some things that you have to do for legal research really are very similar to what you would do anyway for any kind of reference question, and that is to figure out reliability. So as we've discussed, checking to see if it's citing to laws or court opinions is a big thing. Often people will come up with a news article and they'll say, I found this news article that says this is now legal in Wisconsin. And it's talking about a court case, but there's no identifying information. There's no citation you can follow up on. So it's not uncommon for us to try and do a little bit of detective work to try and find what source is somebody is referring to. And for that, there are a lot of tools you can use. We'll talk about them a little bit, but as a general constant reminder, if you are having trouble finding something, please contact us. We're always happy to help. You can just contact our reference desk by phone or email, and we'll help you try and find that for your user. So when you are trying to figure out the reliability of a source, you can use the keywords that the source is using to try and find the primary law. Sometimes that will lead you to Wisconsin source. Sometimes you'll discover that the keywords being used in an article actually are derived from something like California law or Illinois law. So when you are searching for those, be aware that that terminology that's used can sometimes be a really important clue to what it is you're looking for and where it came from. So on our website, we're pretty picky about the information that we include. We post sites that avoid ads. We avoid sources that appear overly biased or don't cite to the law. We have a strong preference for Wisconsin-specific information. And we cover about 400 topics. We also have additional articles in our blog or newsletter, so you can do a site search to find information that way. There are some websites that we will refer our users to in a reference interaction that we will not link to on our website. And the main reason for that is typically because they have automated ads on their website for attorneys. And we do not like to link to sites that are advertising for attorneys or other services like that. But there's one example of a website I'll pull up that we do use a fair amount because it's really readable for our pro se users especially. And they do actually do a fairly good job of citing to their resources. So Nolo is a legal publisher, and some of you may know of these books. They're fairly common to have in public libraries. And Nolo books, I've got a few here. Pull them up so you can see them in the camera. So Nolo has these really basic books. I don't know if that's reversed to you in your camera or not, but what this is the Nolo's Essential Guide to Divorce. And I've got Living Together, a legal guide for unmarried couples. They publish basic books like this that give some general information. I see somebody's got their hand raised. Would you like to type your question in the Q&A and we'll see if we can answer it? I'll also watch the chat for that too. But one source that we'll use a fair amount is the legal articles on Nolo when we're answering basic questions. So one great source that we tend to use are their small claims research pages because they do give basic summaries to how do I file a small claims case. If I had a personal private money agreement with a family member, what do I do? So they take those common reference questions that you might encounter, and they make these readable guides. And some of them are generalized. So things like 50 state chart of dollar limits, or they'll have something on statutes of limitation for cases. But if you do a search of their site, you'll also find a lot of guides specifically tailored or articles specifically tailored to Wisconsin. So sometimes what I'm doing, if I'm answering a question, I think, well, you know, this is a pretty common consumer issue. Maybe Nolo has created something already. I will just do a site search of Nolo's site. So we can try and do a quick site search, whoops, not .org, nolo.com. So I can do a quick search for neighbors on nolo.com. And that can give me some useful sources. So neighbor disputes is a common question we have, or neighbors and noise. And some of these, again, will be specific to Wisconsin, but some of these are just full of practical suggestions that people can take to try and resolve their legal issues. And again, we don't link to this on our site. We used to, but we don't anymore because they do have ads for attorneys. But this is a great source for just really short plain language articles you can help people with. So on our website, common categories you might find include agencies or organizations, links for complaints, links to legal forms, and guides and checklists, and we try and link to relevant primary laws as well. When I'm doing some searching, like you might do with any other research quest is I will use a loose rule of threes for evaluating sources. So if I have 3 books or 3 articles and they're all saying the same thing, they're all citing to the same laws or cases, then I can feel a little bit more confident that I'm giving somebody a good picture of the resources that they need to research. I will also check those sources to see if they meet my other criteria. So are they current? Do they work in context? Do they seem biased? And what's the jurisdiction? Always, always, always look at the jurisdiction. So I was researching a question and just seeing if I could find any general articles on this political sign and homeowners association question. And I found things from other states because other states have specific laws about that for homeowners associations. Um, so always be aware when you're doing a search that the organization has some kind of a stake in Wisconsin or it's citing to something from Wisconsin. And that tends to go for books as well. So these NOLO books are not specific to Wisconsin. And when I'm including or giving a user a chapter or a section from a NOLA book or some of our other general research books, I do always make clear that the information in them is not specific to Wisconsin because people need to be able to draw their own conclusions about whether the information in that source applies to them. So here are some examples of reference questions we've gotten at our library. Do these questions scare you? Do they make you feel like a weak-minded fool? Would you be able to respond if a question like this came into your library? We'll answer these questions at the end of the presentation, and we'll talk a little bit more about some sources and strategies. But first, we're going to go back and talk about the act of providing legal reference. Does anybody have any questions so far that I can answer? Otherwise, we'll swing into our legal reference section. And I don't see any questions coming up, but I'll keep an eye out and we can always circle back. Okay, so let's talk about self-representation. The other term for this is pro se. That's a Latin term. You may see that thrown around as well when you're researching those kind of services. And most people, or more people are representing themselves in court actions than ever before. And those can include things like name changes, divorce, landlord-tenant issues, and small claims actions. And these self-represented litigants are entering the court system often for the first time, and they're completely unfamiliar many times with legal processes. They can be distressed, worried, scared, or confused, and they look to court staff and librarians for help. You know, it's not uncommon that we get phone calls or emails from people who've already been contacting lots and lots of people or organizations trying to find some help or some information for their legal issue. The pandemic, of course, has intensified a lot of these issues and thrown in other procedural confusing things like, how do I attend a Zoom hearing for my court case? We can't provide legal advice to these users. And we also have to remain neutral among any parties in a case. So we provide information. We can't draw conclusions for anybody. We'll talk a little bit about how communication can help you or hurt you when you're trying to do legal reference services in just a bit. So there's a Wisconsin report published recently called Meeting the Challenge of Self-Represented Litigants in Wisconsin. And it talks about the challenges of helping the self-represented. So challenges begin when self-represented litigants make their first contact with the court system. The difficulty arises out of the reality that the legal system is not designed to serve individuals without attorneys. Confusing language or legalese and complicated rules and procedures can alienate litigants representing themselves in court. So what can we do to help? This is an excerpt from a webinar that dealt with health information, but it applies really well to legal reference services. And this, I think, is another area where we can apply that to tax information as well. So when we are answering reference questions from the public, we have to remember that we're not social workers. We can't give people advice. We can't draw conclusions for people. But we do have to be ready to help people who are having difficulty accessing technology, especially now when some public libraries may be closed to the public. We have to figure out how to serve those users. This is where we are actually mailing information to people a lot more than we used to before. When we talk about legal reference service, there's a very real effect that access to information has on how you can help or the extent to which you can help your users. So one thing to remember is that your highest level of service might be different from another library's. For example, your highest level of service might not be the same as the state law library's level of service because we have access to a lot more research resources, books, sample legal forms, databases that may simply be too expensive for most public libraries to be able to budget for. So when you are helping somebody, always be aware of that. And again, reach out to us if there's anything that we can help provide. So just a couple weeks ago, I sent sample forms and some information from one of our books to a public librarian who was trying to find or trying to help their user find some forms. So we are here to help fill in those gaps as well. AALL is the American Association of Law Librarians, and they acknowledge similar limitations in their code of ethics. Not everything is online. Not everything is available digitally, and many law materials are just too expensive for public libraries to buy. What makes legal research so difficult? The biggest thing, and probably the reason you're all here today, is there's a line that librarians cannot cross, and that is the unauthorized practice of law. So in Wisconsin, there is a Supreme Court rule, 23.01, that defines the practice of law. It says the practice of law in Wisconsin is the application of legal principles and judgment with regard to the circumstances or objectives of another entity or person, where there's a client relationship of trust or reliance, and which require the knowledge, judgment, and skill of a person trained as a lawyer. As a librarian, we naturally try and build trust with our users. And sometimes the line between giving information and the practice of law is very clean. And sometimes it's a blurry gray line that you're not sure if you're jumping over. According to the research, my coworker who developed this presentation with me, Jamie Healy-Plotkin, has done, there's no existing case law dealing with the unauthorized practice of law by a librarian. But nobody wants to be the first. So what can we do as librarians? We can help by giving legal reference assistance. Now, I know this slide in particular is kind of hard to read. There's a lot of text. You do have the link to the presentation, and you'll also get that after the class as well. So you'll be able to read this at your leisure. But here are some examples of giving legal reference assistance as a librarian versus giving legal advice. So you can recommend legal reference materials versus offering an opinion on how the law applies to that person. Or you can teach a person how to search within a specific database like Google Scholar Case Law versus interpreting a legal document from a judge or drawing a conclusion for the user like, this is the case you need. We can provide legal reference assistance, which can mean we're helping users find sources. So we'll use our research framework when we're evaluating source and include those caveats. If you find a general discussion on a website or in a book, remind people that it's not specific to Wisconsin, and they need to determine if it applies to them. The same goes for statutes. If you find a statute section that you think might be useful, um, you can't make claims that say this is the statute that applies to your situation. And we'll talk about specific language in just a bit. During the reference interview, we try to get a question out of the patron that we can answer. So just like when you're researching an article you're trying to find out the legitimacy or the source of, you want to pay attention to the keywords that your user is using. Those keywords can be helpful to help you find sources to help them out. I always repeat questions to verify what they're looking for before I start searching. This can also be a good tool just to help focus a question, because sometimes people go into a legal research task with a really broad idea in mind of what they need, and we need to help them narrow it down a little bit. So we can break the question down into parts. If somebody has an employment law question, we can break it down into, are you trying to find out about being fired? Are you trying to find out about your last paycheck? You know, what is the actual area of law or subtopic that you're trying to research, so that we can actually help you find some more targeted information. And remember to always treat people with respect. Of course, I'm sure you don't need to be reminded of this, but you're often working through the research task together, because there are a lot of different topics that you might be researching, and chances are a lot of them are going to be new to you as well. So you can set the expectation right away to the user by saying, I'm a librarian, I can help you find information, and try to emphasize the positive of what you can do for you. So we often will get phone calls who say, I need to talk to somebody about my legal issue. And I will say, well, I'm a librarian and I can help you research this question, or I can help you find sources, um, just so that people understand that they're not talking to you in any kind of legal capacity. If you find a law that might answer the question, you can read or quote it directly or include it in an email to the user. Sometimes I will have people who really want you to read a statute out loud over the phone. And that can be tough, in part because statutes can be really long. A section might be very lengthy, but they also are broken down into parentheses and subsections, and that can be a hard thing to convey over the phone. I always try and really emphasize that people need to read through it themselves. And sometimes that can include sitting somebody down with a resource, or sending an email, or sometimes we'll mail things out just so that they have the source available to them. We do a strong emphasis on terms like may or might when we say, like you may be interested in reviewing this statute, um, just to avoid saying this is what you need, because we can't determine that that's what they need. You need to be prepared for follow-up from the user, but what does that mean? And you can't interpret it. Even if you feel like you've got a pretty good idea of what something means, you can't, I always have to avoid summarizing because people do want you to encapsulate it. Legal terminology, statutes, that can be a lot to wrap people's mind around. But you can't do that quick summary for them. Um, Sometimes what you can do is find articles or books that do have some interpretive function. One source that we like to use is articles from the Wisconsin Lawyer magazine, which is online through the state bar website. And they've got great interpretive articles that talk about the law and are heavily cited and can be really readable for somebody who's trying to find out, what does this statute mean? And then the patron can take that information and they need to take that to the next step of determining whether the information you provided or you helped them find is actually relevant to their situation. As Obi-Wan says, many of the truths that we cling to depend on our point of view. And that's certainly true when you're providing legal reference help. There's usually some information you can share. So you can't use "I cannot give legal advice" as an excuse not to provide service. What you can do is provide sources, links to information, so that people can draw their own conclusions about whether those apply to their situation. So here are some phrases you can use. The law states, or in general, I use that a lot. See this information from this source. So I will often answer reference questions with a book in our collection, Wisconsin Criminal Defense Manual says, and then I'll include a direct quote about whatever topic somebody's asking about. This may help answer your question. This form is used for, so the Wisconsin court system, if you're not aware, has a lot of standard court forms that have been developed for circuit court users. And these standard court forms are grouped by subject. And one thing that's really nice about these that not a lot of people see is that each of these forms, and you can see some are available in different formats or languages, each of these forms has a summary link. And this summary is often missed when people are downloading forms or looking at forms. But as librarians, I really like to use these. When people say, "What's this form for?" Well, there's this field called purpose of form that gives a very short, nice summary of what the form's for, who completes it, and where it's distributed. So some sources like this are great to point to when somebody is asking you that kind of question. Why am I using this form? Who fills it out? That answer can be found. Sometimes you just need to know where to look. So other phrases that I use based on the information we have. I'm a librarian and I can help you find information. I'm not an attorney and I can't give you legal advice. I don't know. Let me look into this and get back to you. This is something I use a lot too, because it may be an area I'm unfamiliar with, or sometimes it's even something I know I've answered before, but I cannot remember where I found the answer. So I need a little bit more time to research it. Phrases to avoid include, "in my opinion," or "you should do that," or "this means XYZ, I predict, if it were me, let me fill that out for you," or "do this and you're all set." So let's tackle that question of "let me fill that out for you." Sometimes you will get people asking for help filling out legal forms, and this may also apply to the tax question too. And we are really strict about not helping people fill out forms. There's a difference between an ADA accommodation request, so you can help with writing something down, but you can't interpret the form. So often people will say, well, where do I put my name? And even something as simple as that, I will tell them, I'm not an attorney. I can't tell you how to fill out this form. What I can do is I can offer definitions. So I can use that court system glossary, for example, to define plaintiff, to define respondent. But if somebody says, well, what box do I check on here? That's not a question that you can answer. You can find interpretive resources for people sometimes that talk about how to fill out a form, but we can't make those calls. We can't tell people what boxes to check or how much detail to go into about their issue. They have to determine that on their own. And this is often where we turn to some of our partners, legal assistance organizations, to try and fill in that gap for people, because we can't tell people how to fill out a form, but there are organizations that exist to help people understand forms and procedures. So for that, we'll often refer people, and I'll just go to our homepage really quick and show you a couple quick sources. We'll refer people either to our legal assistance page sources. There's an organization called Free Legal Answers, which is a website staffed by volunteer Wisconsin attorneys. People do need to create an account to get their question answered, so it does have some technological barriers to it. The other source we'll often use is the State Bar Lawyer Referral and Information Service, which is an 800 number that connects people with a local attorney in their area. Now, our favorite source is our County Legal Resources Directory. And this is a directory of legal agencies or organizations in each county. So we can look at Waukesha, for example, and take a look at legal assistance. And we link to all of the legal organizations that we're aware of that help people with legal issues in that county. So that can be specific targeted issues, or it can be a more general question as well. The other thing that we are starting to refer people to, and we link to on our website, is an organization that has been putting out videos helping people fill out forms or showing how forms are filled out. So on our divorce page, we link to a couple of videos from the Milwaukee Justice Center that show out how to fill out some of these common court forms. It's literally just a video of somebody filling out a court form. So sometimes those kind of resources can help fill in those gaps where you can't answer their question specifically. So what about upset users? What can you do when a user is distressed? Navigating the legal system can be really stressful. So let's go over a few tips and strategies, because you don't want your users to pull your arms out of your sockets. So when you're working with upset users, a lot of it has overlap with what you would ordinarily do when you're doing any kind of training or any kind of interactions with users. But for legal services, you do want to be careful about the words you're using and the responses you're making. So you really want to make sure that you're using neutral terms to acknowledge to the patron that you're an active listener, but you don't want to agree with them, for example, or say that they have a valid legal issue. Even if you think it might make them feel better, you're still making a judgment call that you cannot make. So try and use neutral terms or neutral responses when you are communicating with the user. When you're able to determine what their question is, make sure you repeat it and repeat what you can do for the user. So you can help with legal research and repeat the question that you think you're answering to them so that you can clarify that between you two before you get started. Your body language can convey a lot to your users. So a pleasant smile and neutral hand or arm position, just like any other situation, go a long way towards helping your users feel a little bit calmer. Some people may need to give you the whole story. Even if they come up with a quick question, they may want to tell you everything about it. One thing that I do, while we do generally work with people who tell us the whole story, if somebody offers to send you a contract or an agreement or something else, I tell them, please do not send that. I'm not an attorney. I can't interpret it for you. I can only help you find information. Because that is something that I think they generally think, well, this is going to be helpful to the librarian. They can just read through this and summarize it themselves. And that's really not something that we want them to do. And just like before, you're going to break down those big problems into smaller and more manageable steps. So you want to avoid empathy that can be interpreted as giving a legal opinion. You want to avoid using phrases that validate the patron's issue, even if it's kind of instinctive of you to try and forge a relationship that way. Watch any value judgments when you are trying to respond to a question. There are a lot of resources available that discuss helping distressed library patrons or how to deal with angry individuals. And these can be really helpful when you are handling legal reference questions. So what if the question is clearly illegal to you? For this, you have to stick to what a librarian can do, which is point to information. It's up to the user to read and interpret it for themselves or to seek legal advice for an interpretation. There are often times when you need to use stalling tactics, when you need to research under pressure, and this often applies to in-person services where you've got somebody who's very upset and needs information right away if they can get it. Sorry, I'm going to zoom out there a little bit. Oops. Okay. So I like to get the patrons started with a computer set to a site, like maybe they need to get to the statutes and do some searching. Maybe there's a book, like a general NOLO book or research book they can go to. Maybe you have just a print set of statutes you can get them started on while you're trying to research the question in tandem. You can also contact us for help while you're helping a user or while you're frantically Googling to try and figure out what a term means or where it came from. Okay. So you and your users may come across vendors and websites which offer legal forms. And we're often asked, I found this online, is it legal? Can I use it? As librarians, we cannot answer that question with a yes or no. If it's from a government agency or a trusted source, unless it's from a government agency or trusted source, like standard court forms from the Wisconsin court system website, or maybe the healthcare power of attorney from the Department of Health Services site, we can't make guesses about whether a form is what they should be using. We can tell the user the types of forms we can provide. So if there's a standard statewide form, we can provide that. We can provide links to statutory form language like the parental power of attorney. And we can provide copies of sample forms from our books and databases. And for that, we always make it clear that they are sample forms and they are geared towards attorneys. And they may need to be modified for the user for their specific situation. Especially in situations where there is no standard form, we'll say something like, here are some other examples. You'll need to read through them and determine on your own or with the help of an attorney if it will suit your situation. You may also get forms vendors contacting the library to see if they can sell you their product. And the main things that we look at when we're evaluating those is it worth the money? Are they current forms? Are they simply repackaging free forms you can get from the Wisconsin court system website? And are the forms tailored to your state? Are they for Wisconsin? Or are they kind of a general forms source? Let's journey back to those reference questions from earlier. What would I do to help the patron who asked them? And what kind of information did we provide? So in this first one about firearms, this is a situation where if you're researching firearms law, you are looking at a couple different jurisdictions. You're typically looking at the federal level and the state level. For state law, state does regulate concealed carry permits. So you can generally find all the information you need on that level there. And this is a situation where there are a couple of really good resources we can direct people to. We can give people the direct link to the statute. The Department of Justice has a great FAQ about concealed carry that addresses a lot of questions that people might have. And the Legislative Council also created a summary when the act was passed that gives an overview of the law as well. So there are a lot of different ways to get at this information. And these FAQs and these information memorandums do a good job of repackaging that and summarizing it for the users, because sometimes reading a statute can be a little confusing for people. The other thing that I like to do when I have people researching questions online is I will go to the index. And this is especially nice if somebody is asking if there is a law on a specific issue and I can't find a law. I will often include a link to the index terms that might apply to their situation so people can take a look through that list and determine if any of those are applicable to them. So here, sometimes when I'm answering a basic question about firearms and I don't find a good answer or reference on either the state or the federal level, I will include a link to the full index listing for that term, just so people can review those a little bit and see if there's anything I missed. Because I think what I try and always convey to people is I have found this, these are the sources I've searched, but you may need to do additional research to see if there's anything else that you that might apply to you that I just missed. So these indexes can be really good sources, and these are all linkable. You can copy this link if you're answering something in an email so that people can review all of those. And you can see that statutes for firearms, for example, go all over the place. All of these point to different chapters of the statute, so you can't just give somebody a chapter reference and say, go to chapter 175. You have to go a little bit broader. There's constitution sections that get pulled up. So when you're researching a topic, it can be really good just to direct people sometimes to these indexes for the statutes and administrative code. And one question that we got a lot a while ago was, can I sell CBD oil? And this was a frequent question we got because at the time there was a lot of confusing guidance and different documents saying, implying yes or no from the state. And what we ended up doing was making a blog post of all the resources. And what would happen is people would call us and they would say, is it legal to sell CBD oil in Wisconsin? And at the time, the guidance from the state government was kind of nebulous. And what we ended up doing was compiling a big blog post of all of the sources of information for each side, essentially, so that people could read through it and determine it themselves. And people were disappointed by this answer. You know, they wanted a yes or no answer, and they weren't getting it. And we had to remain firm and say, we can't draw a conclusion for you, but here are all the resources we've compiled so you can go through and come up with your own uh, decision about what that answer is, or talk to an attorney about it instead. And this is an area where rapidly changing law can sometimes make your reference services a little bit complicated. So a great example would be COVID relief or masking requirements or other related issues to the pandemic, eviction moratoriums in terms of extensions, deadlines, who they apply to. These are all things that, especially when they're first released or when they first become an issue, sometimes it can be hard to find information for you users, and that can be frustrating, but we still have to remember we can't draw conclusions. What we can do is try and think, okay, if I can't find information on this, who can I refer them to try and find help? So that can sometimes be identifying agencies that are the key resources for a particular type of research question or legal issue. Often when we can't find a definitive answer, we do tell people to consider talking to an attorney. And in situations where people are asking about the status of a law, like, is this law in effect? What does this law mean? Or even, I don't like this law. We do refer people to speak to their local legislators as well. So this question, my landlord doesn't knock when he comes into our house. This morning he came in and let himself in with his key to check the water heater. Is that legal? And this is an example of needing to reword that question a little bit to figure out what issue we can help them with. So, of course, we can't say yes or no about whether it's legal, but we can rephrase it to, when and why can a landlord enter a rental? And that's information we can find. We can find that information in several sources. So there is a regulation about that. There's also guides on the Tenant Resource Center page that are really readable, easy for people to understand. And there are guides on the Department or Bureau of Consumer Protection, Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection website that walk people through a lot of these common landlord-tenant issues as well. One news source that we just got at the State Law Library, this is just published and it's probably mirror reverse to you, but it's called the Wisconsin Landlord and Tenant Manual. and it is published by the State Bar of Wisconsin. It's just a softbound publication, and it goes through some basic landlord-tenant issues and questions, and in a fairly readable format. It has a lot of citations to laws and regulations, and it can be a good resource to direct people to as well if they need to try and read through a legal issue. So there are a lot of sources that we tend to go to when we are answering research questions. And sometimes we can find a really great answer. This question on landlord entry, we can find a lot of good information for that that typically will answer somebody's question or leave them feeling satisfied with the information they got. There are other areas where it can be a little trickier, because people do need to do a little bit more research into an issue or try and figure out what exactly they're trying to do. So there are a couple examples here. I've got our grandparent rights and responsibilities page up. And we do often get asked about this as a general topic. What are the rights of grandparents? And this can mean a variety of things. And this is where breaking down that reference question is going to be helpful. Because if somebody calls and says, I need to know what are the rights of grandparents, then we need to figure out, well, okay, are you trying to find out about um, whether grandparents can have visitation with grandchildren, which is a common question? Are you trying to figure out how grandparents can have custody of children or be legal guardians of children? Maybe it's even something like financial responsibility for the child of a minor child. So you do have to work with your users to break down those questions because the answers to them can be found in a variety of places. Our grandparents page does address some basic questions about visitation or grandparents raising children. And this is really where we try and concentrate a lot of our information for helping our users. A few things to look at here are under our county resources. We've got a couple of forms from the Milwaukee court. So this is a county court that has created forms for a particular situation. And this is something you'll come across from time to time when you're researching a question. There might not be a standard statewide form for a particular action, but maybe a county court in Wisconsin has created their own for their local residents. And in cases like that, we will point out that it is created, in this case, by Milwaukee County for its residents. And people will ask you, well, can I use this in my county? And again, you can't give a yes or no. You can't promise them, of course you can, just change the county on it. But what we usually do is we tell people to ask their clerk of court if they will accept modified forms from another county. And in fact, we have on our county resources database, as well as spread throughout our legal topics pages, just a subject overview of forms and guides that counties have created for their residents that maybe go beyond what the statewide court system has created for people. So paternity is one example of a question that we get from people who have established paternity and they're trying to now get custody or a support order or visitation. And there aren't standard statewide forms for that, but Dane County has created forms for their users or their residents called the Paternity Acknowledgement Packet, which helps people who have voluntarily acknowledged their paternity with the state to then go to court to determine custody or visitation questions. So there are a lot of situations where the answer that you're looking for on the statewide level might not be there. But sometimes people have addressed that question really well in another area. Another one that I like to highlight is on our marriage page. And on our marriage page, we link to a couple of sources. We link to this information for marriage applicants and officiants, which is just kind of a general overview of what you need to get married. But we also link to this guide from Burnett County. And this guide from Burnett County takes some of the statewide sources, but then it goes through and it gives some really nice FAQs. And while it's created by Burnett County, the FAQs are readable and they do discuss general state law. So for example, they've got something on residency questions or out of state marriage. Like if I want to get married in Hawaii or somewhere else, what does that mean? So it's a really great question. Marrying outside the US is another question we get. I want to get married um, in another country. What do I do? Where do I go? What does that mean? The Burnett County Guide is a great guide, but it's not necessarily the first place you would think to go to for that kind of an answer. A great question, where can we purchase the Wisconsin Landlord and Tenant Manual? You can go to, and let's see if this comes up. I actually haven't tested this, but the WisBar Marketplace site is where you go. So the State Bar's Marketplace site, that's the publisher of the book. That's who sells the book. This is a brand new book. We just got it in our library this week. And you can purchase it from this site here. And you can see, like all legal materials, they are pricey.
We do have a question.
Yes.
Where can you purchase the Wisconsin Landlord and Tenant Manual?
Yes. And you can purchase that from the State Bar of Wisconsin. They've got a marketplace online store you can buy that from. Sometimes you will find less satisfying answers. So one big example that I come up on from time to time is I have a private car sale that went south. What do I do? And there's not a great amount of information on the state level. On the state level, it all has to do with dealers. But if somebody's buying a car from somebody, an individual, there's just not a lot of information you can hand over. So what we'll end up doing is referring them to this really vague, super basic FAQ from the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, about private sales. And then if they want to get more information about small claims cases, for example, we can provide them that as well. So sometimes the answers that you can provide people are unsatisfying, and part of providing legal reference services, I think, is just accepting that sometimes you're not going to be able to find an answer that you think is necessarily helpful, but you've given them some information, and that's at least a building block for them to think about the topic. Maybe that will inspire them to seek legal help, find a legal clinic, talk to an attorney. Maybe at least they can do a little bit more research based on what you've given them. So a reminder to always stay in touch with us, contact us with questions. We have a guide. This is the other handout for our class, and this is something that we created that can be easily printed out and handed out at public service desks. This is just a half sheet that you can print out and cut out. And we have that on our website under publications. And we have a black and white version and a full color version. So we've got a couple of ways for you to just hand your user a flyer if you don't want to be the intermediary in a legal research question. So let's wrap this up. Are there any other questions that I can answer? Hopefully you can refer to some of those phrases to use or not to use and practice those a little bit because it does take some practice getting used to changing the way you're responding to users so that you can respond and use terms in a more neutral way because it is a habit. You know, speaking patterns are hard habits to break. And speaking patterns when you're helping users, those can be heavily ingrained. So what I had to do when I first started legal reference really was retrain some of the ways that I responded to users to be extra careful about not um, giving advice or making it seem like I was validating an issue. Okay, so no questions are coming in so far. Just a reminder, you can reach out either to me at any time or to the State Law Library's reference desk. I do have a couple more books to show you before as we close up today. So one resource that we find can be helpful for users and public libraries who have the funding can think about getting some of these are other state bar publications. So there are publications that a lot of people just call brown binders because brown binders. And these are loose leaf sources. This is the Civil Litigation Forms Manual, and it has just really basic sample forms. So sometimes we'll turn to this to give people a very generic form example that they can go off of. And if other general resource that we have in our collection that may or may not be helpful to your library users, these are called nutshell books. So this is adoption laws in a nutshell, and they're really slim volumes. They're usually pretty condensed, fine text, and they can give a broad overview of a research topic, but they are a little bit more geared towards attorneys. They can be a little bit more complex to try and read through. So these are useful resources and they're really easy sources to hand over to people, but they can be a little bit more complex sometimes for a casual reader. Okay, well, I don't see any other questions, so I'll let Lori go ahead and wrap up.
So thank you. You want to show your last slide? It has your contact information.
Oh,
Thank
absolutely.
you.
Actually,
It will be in the slides, of
yep.
course, then too.
Let me get
Thanks.
over there.
So, yeah, thank you, Carol, for providing such valuable training for us. It was a lot of information. So I'm
Yes.
sure it'll be a while for everybody to absorb. So all attendees will receive an email with a link to an evaluation form. Please watch for that. You will also receive a link to the SUI Libraries Archives webpage where you will find the recording, slides, and a CE activity report form from those who need it. So, and with that, I will be stopping the recording. And